program partners. And I'm going to introduce Brecha to my left over here, and Nisha right there on screen below us, right? And if you guys can introduce yourself, and then we can get started with the conversation.
Good, thanks, Rajiv. Shall I just go first?
Yes.
Yeah. So my name is Brechtje. I live and work in the Netherlands, in Amsterdam. And my professional background is in consulting. And sorry, I was distracted there because I got a pop-up. My professional background is in consulting, and through personal circumstances, I wanted to change my life, basically. Wanted to change my professional life, but also looking more into who I am. And I got into coaching, and eventually the path led me to grief counseling, grief coaching, I should say. So that's why and how I am here. And I personally, I live with my two sons, 14 and almost 11, here in the Netherlands.
All right.
Anisha?
So I'm Nisha Jangani, and I am the founder of Mind Wellness, and I'm a practicing psychotherapist. And I'm also a program partner with one of Rajiv's programs called Mindfully You. And we journey together basically on all mental well-being and mental emotional related issues. And I'm excited to talk about grief today, in fact, with you too, Brecha. It's because I feel it's a topic that's pretty relevant to the hour that we are in right now, because we were just discussing, I think, before we came on, that the times we're in, I think people are experiencing grief in so many ways today that it definitely warrants the conversation.
Absolutely. And it's an honor to be with you guys. And obviously, you know, as we do programs together and people ask us, you know, whatever their circumstances, as they're going through this situation with grief and dealing with the situation, right? A lot of times they'll ask us, so how do you know what's the right way to do it? You know, there's all these questions that pop up, right? And my 2 cents on that has always been, you know, there really isn't a right way. There is probably suggested ways, right? And of course, that's where both of you come into the programs that we all do together. But ultimately, it's an experience, it's a journey. And as we go through it, you know, we are also learning and experiencing, right? So, which brings me to my first question, and I'll throw it out to both of you and see how this lands. As a layman, right? So when you're in a situation where you're, you know, say, you know, something has happened, whether it's some trauma, some change in life, something that causes you to so-called get into a space of grief, how do you recognize it? How do you bring awareness that, wait a second, I'm feeling grief, you know, because it could be something else, right? So this is a layman's question to both of you.
I don't know who wants to go first.
Are we going to do this always?
Yeah,
let's do this. Yeah.
So let's think about the layman's point of view. I think two things kind of stand out to me. Is grief is a more intense emotion. So it's important to recognize that what you were talking about, Rajiv, is the experience, right? There's some experience that sort of leads you into that state. Now, when one marker I look out for is when the emotion is intense enough that it starts to affect you in your day-to-day life, and you can feel it either emotionally, physically, or even the way you're showing up in your life, there will be a significant change. And I think that's one of the markers to let you know that you've been encountering an intense emotion. And grief is the more intense range when it comes to sadness. So I feel like that's one way to look at it in your life is, are you noticing that feeling or experience of grief interfering or beginning to interfere in parts of your life? So that's one marker I'd look out for. And the second, in relation to that, is the intensity of the feeling, because this one's a bit more subjective. So you would understand your normal rhythm of emotions. And when you notice something that's standing out or being more intense in one of these ways, then it lets you know that, hey, I might have gone into the zone of grief. So that's my layman's take on that.
But I love that, because it does explain two things, right? One is that you recognize that something is, you know, your normal patterns have changed. It's what I heard you say, right? So there is suddenly it's maybe affecting the way you usually live, right? And the emotion is so strong, it's so intense. So I like the word you used, was really intense emotion. So you can specifically identify, wait a second, this is not normal sadness, it's not normal, you know. And am I using the right words? Would that be, is that the right way to say it? I mean, it's an intense emotion, and it's overpowering your overall day, is what I'm hearing you say. Is that right, Ish?
Yes, so that will be one way to look at it. But the extent to which, like I said, the extent to which that overwhelm happens, or the extent to which this happens, will vary from person to person. But the changes is something changes in the way we show up and how we're feeling would be the two areas to look at.
Oh, brilliant.
Yeah, I can agree to that. And then perhaps also the length of how long you feel disrupted or preoccupied with certain emotion or certain more intense emotions could be something that can tell you that you are in grief. Yeah.
It's such a situation where many people around the world, obviously, as they, you know, as things change, and you know, they start to get into this process where maybe they are grieving, and you know, they always, I mean, there is an association between, you know, grieving because you lose someone close to you, or someone in your life, and then there's other circumstances where maybe something in life has changed. Maybe you know, you lost a job, or you know, something has moved on, right? You can also grieve in those cases as well, right? It doesn't necessarily have to only be related to a loss, right? Can we talk about that for a bit? Because that's really a real reality for many people, right? With so many changes.
Yeah,
absolutely.
True. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. My take on that is that it has to do with bonding. So if it depends on how you bond with something or someone, and the moment you lose that, or that someone, it does something. You have to let go, basically, or unbond, and that is where a grieving process would start. And depending on how important, or how the way fast, or the way that path where you have to let go will tell something, will let you grieve. But it has to do, for me, I guess, in my view, with the way you bond with it.
Like that.
I'll add to this. I think so. In relation to our current context, I think one area to talk about is also ambiguity or ambiguous grief. So this goes back to the losses. Now, what you were saying, Raj, is when there are clear-cut losses in our life. You know, you lost a person, even sometimes losing a job. These would stand in the front of your mind if you're experiencing emotions of grief. But now, say for example, the time we've been in the past few months, how many people, whether they realized it or not, encountered loss of freedom?
Yeah.
Loss of mobility. Now, we might, you know, in our day-to-day lives, it could have affected people. It could have started to, you know, sort of trigger some of those feelings of grief without there even being a very obvious that, oh, I lost someone, something, or somebody. This is more innate. You know, it could even be the loss of a state, the loss of a sense of familiarity, the loss of, you know, so people say, you know, I lost okay, job would be obvious, but I can't stay in the same place I once used to, for example. So am I allowed to feel grief? I think it really boils down to, you're actually allowed to feel however you want to, and however you feel is correct. It's about identifying when that becomes overwhelming for you and when you're not able to go for it. So this will still go back to my first answer of whether you may be conscious of the reason or not, it's good to know when you're in that state so that you can work towards it.
Exactly.
I love that. I love that explanation. You know, it's such a powerful space to, you know, when you're experiencing it, right? And this leads me to my next question, right? When you're experiencing it, you know, it can be an emotional turmoil, right? Because it's obviously something you didn't prepare for. It happens and it overtakes your life. And what I heard you guys say is it can impact, you know, your day to day. But when you're in the middle of this emotion, right? You're suddenly feeling all this overwhelm, right? How do you say, okay, well, you know, how do you rationally say, okay, well, I've read something about handling this, you know how, because, you know, everyone always wants to somehow be in control, right? So and I've heard many cases where people have associated guilt to the way they're handling something. Like, this is not the way I'm supposed to handle it, right? So you're in this emotional state, and you want to, you can't really rationally think. Let's say, how do you handle it from that space? So what would be some tips that we can maybe throw out for everyone today, even on Facebook, and what can we share with them? Like, what could they do to, maybe deal with these emotions?
Okay, Raj, I think we'll break down your question actually into two parts. So first bit was rationalizing. And so
Yes.
I like to look at it, and I will give a very layman metaphor for actually it is a psychology-based model, but I want you to imagine a pendulum, yeah, that goes from right to left and right to left, right? So what ends up happening is typically when you're going through grief in a manageable range, yeah, so it's still grief, but there is some capacity to manage, you will experience this pendulum. One side will be when you're taking time to actually cope or address the grief or the feelings of grief that you're going through. And the other side is when you'll have some capacity to maybe deal with what you have to deal with. So it's kind of back to forth. You'll have to address whatever it is around the emotions you're feeling, and then you'll have some capacity to show up in your day-to-day life. It may not be in the same way, but that's kind of the oscillation we do take. So if you are experiencing grief and you can, or when you do have those moments where you have to show up in the world in the way you can, but be kind to yourself while doing it. So in the absence of any other external support, what someone can do for themselves, my key is self-compassion. Because we have this expectation, this gigantic expectation, especially in major losses, to pick up the pieces, to be strong, to show up for other people, to carry the burden of the new world that you're sort of living in immediately. And I think that's kind of where we, in fact, hinder ourselves a lot more. That's simply because we are not honoring that space within us. So in that framework of penduluming, it's important to take that pause in the middle to be kind to yourself and actually allow feeling the emotion. I know it's uncomfortable. So the message I want to put out there, it's never usually very comfortable to be in the space of grief. So I would say do it in as much doses as you can, where if you need to sit down and cry, if you just need to sit down, be with your feelings, sit down, be with your thoughts. And sitting still might be too much, but some way in your own way, you can explore this as comfortable for you, staying with the feeling. So I feel like that's one way to look at it. However, I'm going to put a little bit of a PSA over here, is that if you are feeling an extreme grief and you feel like you're not even being able to make that swing and you're stuck somewhere right in the middle where you can't move, that is actually a very, very good indicator where talking to someone, and this I would encourage professionally, if you can engage with someone professionally, do reach out to them for support, because it's actually the most beneficial thing you can do for yourself when you're in that state. It'll gradually help you move forward.
Having someone hold that space for you so that you can better manage the situation. Yeah.
Yes.
Exactly.
I like that.
Yeah, I like that. Yeah.
Becca, your thoughts?
Yeah, beautiful thing is that I was exactly thinking as well about the pendulum, right? It is from grieving, but also, and I would like to add the recovery part of it. So, and that's where I believe how I would interpret also the self-compassion that you mentioned, Disha, is there are points where you will also feel happy and you will also be able to look around, and a lot of times people feel guilty, for example, that they felt happiness again because they should be grieving. And grieving is not a state, right? There's also no time for it. Not like it's over in 5 months or a year or in 15 years. We don't know, right? But there's moments of grief and there's moments of recovery, and that's where you will find yourself go back and forth. And in what helps me helped me in moments of recovery is also to really look at to see if I could feel gratitude, and because that will help me help me in cases of grief, but help my clients as well to also be when you're in the state of grief, to see, okay, so yes, I am, you build resilience through it. So you are able and better able to stay in the state of grief or in the not state of grief, in the moment of grief,
Mm.
and go back to the recovery side again. So it's self-compassion, it's looking at gratitude, but it's also really acknowledging what you feel when you are feeling the grief. Yes.
And
You
I
know,
think
which reminds
what,
me.
sorry,
Sorry, Nish,
I'll
go
just
for it. Go for it.
bounce off that point because Becca touched on something so important, which is the expectation. So, you know what she mentioned, that when you feel happy and are like, oh no,
Yeah.
this is how I'm supposed to feel grief. I wanted to touch on that because I feel like one very key part of the healing process can actually be simply looking at your expectations on how you're told to or supposed to manage grief versus what your own journey is. And I think anyone would
Yeah.
tell you on this process is no
Yeah.
two people are going to have the same grief journey or grief
Experience.
process.
Right.
And whatever
Right.
is your process is okay. It's just,
Yeah.
and also what she pointed out was brilliant, is that when you go into that space of grief, you allow for it. When you come back, you're bringing a piece of resiliency with you because you've attended to the emotion. So it's a process that moves. I have another metaphor for it, but we'll tap on it in the next answer. But thank you, Becca. That was a brilliant point.
So I want to share an experience. I mean, when we had a Labrador, who was part of us. Anisha, I told you about this story, right? So Bingo was with us. I literally had him in high school, and he passed. He was around for 20 years back, right?
Mm.
And so he was like family, and I loved him to death, right? And every time I'd come back, to Dubai when I was in college, I'd come back and I'd take him to the beach running, and we had this bond, and obviously his family. It was really tough when he passed, right? And I remember that experience where, you are in this pain. You obviously feel the pain of loss, but it helped to also look at the moments that we had, and really appreciate those moments, because for those of us who had pets, it sometimes they become family to us, right? But it helped me when I was going through that grieving process, that it just being able to look at. And so I really appreciated the point of saying gratitude, having them in our life, that experience. It made it so much more special when I could focus on that positive side of things as well. It helped me cope with it, on a personal level. And the more I dwelled on that, on all the good things that I had, the more I saw what a precious gift he was for those 20 years to us, right? And it did, I don't want to say diluted the pain, but it allowed me to kind of cope with the whole scenario a little better. And for me personally, that really helped. I can't wait for the next dog so that the kids have the same experiences as I did, right?
Yeah. Keeping memories alive is very important, right? Keeping memories alive, telling your story over and over again, writing. I would always, it helped me, but I would always recommend to write. It keeps memories alive, and it helps you see at the good things, but also acknowledge what pain there is, and how, and that's it gives you also a little bit of distance of that pain. You will then not be the pain, but have the pain, where you can distance yourself a little bit from it. Yeah, but step by step often.
I like that. The writing is a great tool. So it's a tool that we can apply, and it helps you with the coping scenario. That's a great tool.
Exactly.
Nish, do you have any other tools as well that you can suggest for?
So I feel like this is a time where I first want to introduce an idea. And I think this idea in and of itself can be quite healing. I have to quote it because I'm actually going to look up a reference for you. This was a very genius creation, and it's by someone who actually just put it up on Twitter. So I'm going to quote her Twitter handle. Her name is Lauren Herschel. And she created this sort of image. It was a box, just a simple box. Imagine a simple box. And on one side of the box is a giant red button. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And
Okay.
inside the box is a really big ball. Okay.
A ball. Okay.
And a moving ball. So the ball bounces from side to side to side. And then there's this button on one end. So this ball is moving. And as it moves, because it's so big, chances are it'll hit the button.
Sides.
Imagine
hit the button.
that.
Okay.
Hit the button. Now imagine this
Okay.
button is grief. Okay. And you have this very big ball. So initially what's going to happen is that button is going to be pressed quite a bit because this is giant ball. I'm sorry, I don't have the image on hand to show it to you, but this giant ball is constantly pressing on the button. And over time, what happens is this ball shrinks. So it starts to hit the walls, but once in a while, it'll touch the button. and then it'll become smaller. And over time, that's
Yeah.
what happens. That button will on and off occasion. So they say a lot of things bring back recall. Sometimes it can be a smell, a sound, a sight, or an experience. But when that happens, the idea, if you can just tell yourself, is, oh, my button was pressed, and that's okay.
Mm.
So even initially when you're going through it, if you can, this is another version of doing that slight distancing so that you know you're experiencing grief, but you are not grief, is to understand it this way.
Yeah.
That it's just, it is a mechanism, it's a button. This is what your body will do. It will bring it up for you to process. So in my video for this, actually, we talked about the fastest way out is through, is if we can
Right.
stay with it and know that, okay, this is my button. My button's telling me I need to sit with this feeling, write this feeling, draw this feeling, maybe even type up something around this specific memory or emotion, or even just stay with it. My mind and my body is bringing this up for a reason. And then when you sit with that and say, and that is okay, just the phrase, and that is okay, you can move on. The next time, every time you experience that moment of grief, you just go with that analogy. It was just my button. So why I brought that up is because it was an example, but I found it very powerful in simply because it does that transference beautifully.
Exactly.
That it's
Yeah.
one part of me, this grief is one part of my experience, and it'll go through its cycle. So I'm putting
I
this
love
up
that
for the
analogy.
viewers, and I hope it helps.
Me too. And I guess also by affirming to yourself it is okay, you reduce the stress level in your body, right? Which brings, because your body responds to grief, because your stress levels are very high, right? And that's just a normal response from your brain. But by saying that a positive affirmation and acknowledging the grief, I guess you would reduce. I don't have any research on this, right? But I guess you would reduce the stress level in your body, which automatically makes you calmer and makes you respond less intense to what you're feeling.
Actually, Rekha, there is more theory coming out on that. There's this concept of the polyvagal theory, and it's quite powerful, that says the narrative that we tell ourselves actually also, informs our body's states of being.
Exactly.
So I think that's quite powerful. And yes, completely coming back to that, the affirmation is important, but at the same time, just highlighting that it's about staying with that feeling where it is.
Exactly.
It's not running away, but acknowledging that is there and then saying it's okay. So the stress point is important, Rekha, because this is what we're circling back to, is that the expectations we have of ourselves can sometimes be so high that a lot of the time the dysregulation you're feeling is maybe not even as much the grief, but your guilt, your sense of responsibilities, the pressure you put on yourself, the expectation of how to behave in grief can be so high that that's what ends up collapsing you. So that's a note to be aware of for anybody, if you happen to be on this journey. It's just a small thought that I hope helps.
Nisha, I just for a second, to pause this conversation, because when I hear both of the things you guys have said, they're so powerful, and even the imagery that when you look back and when you see this, it really is. I mean, I don't know if you guys saw that, but the bouncing ball was a perfect analogy of how you're feeling at the moment, right?
Because you're like, I
when
will
you're going
share
through that,
the link with the team.
that
and
image,
hopefully
please,
they can
that'd be
put
cool.
it on. Hopefully they can share it on the end of this post, and people will find it useful.
And so I love that. And further to that, here's a question for you guys. Okay, it's come from the audience. It says, how can you forget a traumatic experience? So when you go through trauma, how can you? I guess the word is forget, or how can you better overcome it? What do you guys think?
It's beautiful, because the word forget touched me, because my question would be, would you rather forget it and then push it away, or would you like to find a way to integrate it in who you are, or in your life, right? And I guess there's not one answer to that on the how do you do that. I wish I would have a magic stick, right? But I guess it's time. And I guess it is also coming back again to acknowledging it is there. And besides all there are therapies and there are ways to really work with that image and rewire your brain, right? And on the other end, it is time, and it is acknowledging and looking at what is there for it to have that ball shrink. Yeah? Nisha, to use your so that ball will shrink eventually.
I like that. I wanted to add something to this question. Is I really connected to what you just said about forgetting or looking at it again. So I see this as when you're in the situation, it's so traumatic, right? Because you're experiencing the trauma at that point in time. Yet in life, when a lot of us look back at something and you look at it from on top, right? You're not in the experience, but you look at it from on top. It's such a different lesson that you can take from it, right? So I agree with you necessarily. I'm not saying it's right or wrong, but I would say that forgetting, for me personally, it was instead of forgetting, it was experiencing it and then, maybe dealing with it while you're in that situation, but then having it there, and so you can go back and look at it from a different angle and take that as a precious learning. Now, I don't know, theoretically, Nisha, how would...
So I will jump in over here because it's
Yes,
important
please.
to know a couple of things about trauma. So what ends up happening is that while we may want to consciously tell ourselves, okay, I want to forget about it or not think about it, I'm going to be real over here. You're, and making this an as ordinary speak as possible, is that it doesn't go away. You can send it away from your mind. What might end up happening is then it may transfer to your body. So forgetting wouldn't, it's about a choice. And I'm not saying that, and I always want to leave with people, it's a choice to make. However, forgetting can be a choice that down the line, if you don't actually address in some way the trauma that you started with, can end up becoming a hurdle in other areas of your life. So instead of a route of forgetting, and this I'm bearing in mind where even extreme trauma is concerned, it's not about immediately saying, okay, I can reach a stage of acceptance with it, because that might be also too big a jump for somebody who might have a very traumatic experience. So what I would encourage, again, and this I will put it out there as well, is that if trauma is big enough, work with someone and a professional you feel you can resonate with and who can make you feel safe and comfortable to help you break. Now imagine trauma as one giant brick, okay? And I'm only using the example of like extreme versions of trauma if you want, but we all go through trauma in some parts of our life. It's this brick. And what you want to do is eventually take a hammer and slowly chisel away at it, so that it's not one that you're constantly, again, like the button thing, you're not constantly hitting up against. So you do want to over time work towards breaking that thing down into pieces, smaller pieces that are manageable for you. And that's the way I look at it, is simply because I do want to address this. A lot of people, and I mentioned this earlier as well, is that whether it's grief or trauma-induced grief, for example, if we don't start to at least look at it or acknowledge it, what will end up happening is that feeling, whether you realize it or not, will start to control you from the background. It will start to inform your decisions to a point where then you can't function the way you'd normally function to. So it's not something that may happen immediately, but over time you may find that happening. So if you do find that happening, again, I will bring it back to important to working through it. And like I said, everybody will find this in their own stages. Some may want to start working with it with themselves, working through it with close family members. But eventually, if it's significant enough that it's affecting you, I would definitely encourage you to seek some support for it. That's where I land with it.
Brilliant.
And I love what you're saying, Nisha, about the brick and chiseling it away, because it can feel and in your imagination and be not only in your imagination so big, so huge that you don't know where to start, or it's a total overwhelm. And if you can work with someone or find a way to look at it in different pieces, where it, as you beautifully say, is manageable to you, then it will slowly but surely be less overwhelming. And thank you.
I mean, you listen to this conversation, and the takeaways are there are some summaries here. Being self-compassionate, kind to yourself. Allowing yourself to go through it. I love the analogies you've thrown today, Nisha. You've you've got me like a kid looking at these. I'm seeing these images, but I can see it. I love the wall. You know, you're chipping away. But what it's telling me is you have to be present, right? So you have to be present, Brekha, if you want to chip away.
Exactly.
You can't hide. You cannot hide. You have to confront. I also appreciate that question about forgetting, because, you know, it makes you really think and contemplate. Is it about forgetting, or is it about dealing with it? And also knowing when to reach out to a professional to help you out, so that you don't have to deal with it alone. What I'm hearing is that a lot of times people either want to rush it, or they want to deal with it, and they feel, no, everyone deals with it, I can deal with it. But maybe you need to reach out to someone. There's nothing wrong with that. There is people out there like you guys and the programs that we're doing that does help. So there is always that window, right? Which people can reach out. So I appreciate, you know, guys, I love this conversation. Let's talk about, okay, so a question, I mean, it's a similar question, so I'm going to throw it out. I know you kind of answered that, Nish, and again, coming to you as well. Trauma and acute trauma. I mean, you did address that. Acute trauma also would be professionals, dealing with professionals. Would you want to add anything on acute trauma, how to deal with that?
Okay, so I feel like this one, it is important to classify. Again, I go with my understanding of trauma from the point of there is a person who has had extreme or, you know, sort of acute then experiences of trauma that are sort of very
Right.
visible, tangible, front of mind, and that do occupy someone. I would definitely in those situations encourage someone to work with a professional who knows what they're doing. Yeah. Having said that, there's another category though also. Our conventional understanding of trauma is one. However, people who have had difficulties or past experiences or cumulative experiences of disconnect or of ruptures, I will not get too much into it, can also end up having quite a profound effect on a person's life. So I will just make it easier this way. As an individual, yeah, from a person's point of view, what you do want to look out for with those markers is if you feel you're being overwhelmed by the feeling or by the experiences. Sometimes, and in very rare cases, you may have, if it's trauma that's happened earlier in childhood, it can get suppressed or repressed or earlier on in life. So you may not even know that it's trauma that's triggering that button. So it's just important to know as an individual where you're feeling emotional overwhelm, if you feel like you're not being able to cope, if you feel that, you know, your day-to-day life is being affected and you're not functioning the way you would, a normal person would be able to do, showing up at work, showing up at home, then that's a good marker or indicator to tell you that, hey, maybe I need to look into this more, and maybe I need to work into a professional. So an individual doesn't have to get into diagnosing or dissecting what's, you know, a relevant trauma, or in fact, even I don't even want a person to label themselves that I've had, you know, maybe not knowing the very classical definitions of trauma aside. Oh, have I been traumatized? Was this traumatizing? Like, it's, they don't have to go into that. It's about, am I being affected? And if I am, can I seek help? Rajiv, I'm going to add one small point. This was when you closed the last statement, is about seeking help. And this is what I advocate for very strongly. So I'm going to make a sentence. Seeking help does not mean you're weak. Seeking help means that you are choosing to be strong and choosing to empower yourself. Yeah?
Brilliant.
I want that message to stay with people, because
Beautiful.
the reason that people stop is like, oh no, I have to get help, you know, or oh no, there's something wrong with me. No, grief, pain, even if it's trauma, it is not your fault. It's not something that you have to deal with alone. If you choose to address it, you're being a very strong and very capable and even a self-responsible individual.
Yes.
So do it for nobody else, just for you as your own self-care. There's absolutely nothing wrong in seeking out for support.
Beautiful. Those are brilliant final words.
I wanted to say that, but I
thank you.
And I think I'll add to the fact that, you know, there's, and for many men out there, you know, that feel, you know, that's a great statement. Thank you for sharing, Nisha. Brilliant.
Thank you.
I've enjoyed this conversation, guys. And Rekha, any final parting words before we say bye to all that Facebook?
Yeah. After what Nisha said, I can only second that. Yeah. No, it especially that if you feel that that your life is, or that you feel disrupted, or something is going on, what you beautifully said is, don't judge yourself, or don't try to, because you don't know, just ask for help, and talk to someone. You don't need to do it alone. And often I see people trying to think, well, I tried to find a solution and I can't get around, and I don't know what my question is, and I don't know what this is about. It doesn't matter, because that's what you are and can find out by talking to someone who can support you. So you don't have to figure it out before you reach out.
Yes.
Brilliant. I love that. And I guess I would, first of all, thank you both for this amazing topic. The message I take away with me is that, you know, we each have our own unique way of experiencing and dealing. And at the same time, you know, there is suggested ways that can help, you know. I found even in my personal situation, it was going to things that I love to do as well, kind of putting more emphasis on that as well. So there is that angle of positivity you can add that can help. It doesn't necessarily take away from, you know, experiencing the grief. But it's been an honor, guys. Thank you for both of you coming together and sharing this topic. And to everyone out there, thank you for your questions. And if you have more, please reach out to us. I'm going to get sure that, you know, make sure that Nisha and Becca answer them. And yeah, absolutely. It's been a pleasure. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you.
See you guys.
Bye-bye.
So
Raj,